Good evening. It's good to be with you. Yes, I could say a lot of things before I begin my paper, but my paper will take up the full amount of time I've been given, so let me just jump into it. The paper is called Eberhard Bethge and the Myth of Bonhoeffer the Assassin, Recovering a Persistently Christ-Centered Ethic in a World Full of Nazis. The following are the alluring words on the cover of the New York Times best-selling biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer by Eric Metaxas. As Adolf Hitler and the Nazis seduced a nation, bullied a continent, and attempted to exterminate the Jews of Europe, a small number of dissidents and saboteurs worked to dismantle the Third Reich from the inside. One of these was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a pastor and author known as much for such spiritual classics as The Cost of Discipleship and Life Together as for his 1945 execution in a concentration camp for his part in the plot to assassinate Hitler. This biography may not be well respected in the academy, but I think this quote names what are the two best known and very important facts about Bonhoeffer. First, he was executed for being involved in attempts to kill Hitler, and second, he was the author of two widely read books. One of them, The Cost of Discipleship, seems to suggest that he was, in the mid-1930s, some sort of pacifist. Therefore, it follows that his later involvement in attempts to kill Hitler shows that he was in the end a faithful student of his former teacher, Reinhold Niebuhr. For he realized that when you face the horrendous realities of a violent and cruel Nazi regime, especially the murder of millions of Jews, you are morally compelled to become a realist, willing to employ violence to stop those who perpetrate such gross injustices. In fact, precisely because of this about-face, he is seen as one of the most powerful exemplars of the Niebuhrian realist approach. As one visiting scholar at Eastern Mennonite University provocatively put it to me, if it weren't for Bonhoeffer, I would be a pacifist. However, what if one of these so-called facts about Bonhoeffer is not really a fact at all? What if he was not executed for his part in the plot to assassinate Hitler? But if he was not, then why do so many people, including more than a few academics in theological disciplines, believe that he was? That question and the implications flowing from it are what this paper is intended to address. Since the publication of our book, Bonhoeffer the Assassin, in 2013, I have become clearer about what I believe are the two sources of the myth. And it is a myth that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was personally involved in attempts to kill Hitler and also shifted from being a pacifist to being a Niebuhrian-type realist. The first source is simply the repetition of the claim that Bonhoeffer was executed for his part in the plot to assassinate Hitler. When this unsubstantiated claim is repeated often enough, understandably, most people will simply believe it is true. However, more significantly, I've come to believe that the origin of this myth is Eberhard Bethge, one of Bonhoeffer's closest friends and the most important biographer of Bonhoeffer. I have become convinced that Bethge wanted his readers to believe something like what I have described as Niebuhrian realism. But before I begin my summary of Bethge, let me be clear. Anyone working seriously to understand Dietrich Bonhoeffer is deeply indebted to his friend and biographer Eberhard Bethge. His lengthy biography is an indispensable source for understanding Bonhoeffer's life, and his loyalty in sustaining his friend's legacy is laudable. His commitments and the commitments of other Bonhoeffer scholars have culminated in what is now the comprehensive collection of 16 volumes of Bonhoeffer's writings, all now available in English. Ironically, it is also these 16 volumes that will, I imagine, provide the resources for scholars like myself to question various interpretations of Bonhoeffer by Bethge. My questions have emerged after over 40 years of living with Bethge's biography, reading most of the 16 volumes of Bonhoeffer's writings, and grappling with much of the most relevant secondary literature on the subject, which includes reading numerous detailed accounts of the attempts to assassinate Hitler. It is only within the last few years that I have come to my current convictions about the consistency of Bonhoeffer's life and thought from 1931 to 1945, and simultaneously that I've come to realize that the myth of Bonhoeffer's personal involvement in attempts on Hitler's life comes from Bethge. It is not that he says it straightforwardly, but I believe it is the impression that is left on many readers of Bethge's detailed biography of Bonhoeffer. That is to say, I have become convinced that Bethge has framed his account of Bonhoeffer's life, especially his involvement in the conspiracy, in such a way that the readers of his biography are led to embrace the myth of Bonhoeffer's personal involvement in attempts on Hitler's life, which led to his arrest, imprisonment, and execution at the hands of the Nazis. In this paper, I am seeking both to show how Bethge is the source and in outline to correct this myth, since I believe that in ways that matter, this is indeed a myth and not a conclusion drawn from a careful examination of the facts. Needless to say, many more details are offered in the book Bonhoeffer the Assassin, and a few more essays I have written since that book was published in 2013. So, Bethge's template for our reading of Bonhoeffer. Eberhard Bethge discusses Bonhoeffer's role in the conspiracy in part 3 of his 1,000-page biography of Bonhoeffer. However, to make sure the readers see what Bethge wants them to see, at the end of part 2 there is a short section entitled Christian and Man for His Times, which provides the readers with a template, a guide, if you will, for reading part 3. By telling us that Bonhoeffer became a man for his times beginning in 1939, Bethge apparently wants the readers to agree with his assessment of Bonhoeffer's experiment and life together with his students at the Finkenwalde Seminary, the seminary he founded and directed from 1935 to 1937. Now, of course, Bethge had a deep appreciation of the pastoral training Bonhoeffer offered at Finkenwalde, for after all, this is where he met him, and it is where they first became good friends. Nonetheless, in retrospect, Bethge came to believe that the approach to discipleship that Bonhoeffer taught did not truly engage the real world, did not reflect a man who was relevant to his times. Thus, this was a temporary passing phase of Bonhoeffer's short life. Bethge recognized that there was clearly something enriching and deepening about Bonhoeffer's experiences in New York City in 1930-31, especially his involvement in Abyssinian Baptist Church, a large black Baptist church there. His way to name this was to say that these experiences helped, quote, the theologian to become a Christian. But it was also necessary for Bonhoeffer to become a man for his times after his second stay in New York City in 1939. For the world he entered when he returned to Germany from the U.S. after a brief stay in the summer of 1939 called for a significantly different form of existence for Bonhoeffer, with a parallel adjustment to his theological ethic. For as Bethge puts it, in 1939, Bonhoeffer entered the difficult world of assessing what was expedient, of success and failure, tactics and camouflage. Thus, Bethge helps us to see that beginning in 1939, Bonhoeffer leaves behind some of the theological commitments he had named so compellingly in Discipleship and Life Together. The time to imagine being only a Christian, a timeless disciple, was past for Bonhoeffer. Living out discipleship now suddenly appeared to keep one in a realm of respectable but irrelevant privacy, and its structure appeared to be virtually an abstraction. Put differently, according to Bethge, discipleship was now a costly privilege Bonhoeffer could no longer afford. This became even more compelling to Bonhoeffer as he saw what was being done to the Jews by the Nazi regime. The times required that he allow even his innermost commitments, such as his stand for Christian pacifism, to be transformed. The resistor, who had now agreed to the coup d'etat, no longer discussed questions like violence or nonviolence. Concerns about expediency, tactics, and camouflage would now be defining. In October of 1940, Bonhoeffer became a staff member of the military intelligence agency, the Abwehr. From Bethge's account, it appears that the Abwehr was mostly a front for conspirators. For we are told that through the Abwehr, though the Abwehr was not staffed solely by resistance people, it nevertheless was a nest of resistance. And we are informed that what was most important about his involvement in this military intelligence agency is that it freed Bonhoeffer for the work of the conspiracy in Hans Oster's and Hans von Donani's circle, a network of conspirators clearly involved in plots to kill Hitler. In fact, we had been informed earlier in the chapter that Bonhoeffer was sent to prison because of being a member of the military intelligence. Early on in his account, Bethge informs us that for a long time, Bonhoeffer merely knew and approved of what was going on in terms of the plans for a coup, until his knowledge and approval led finally to cooperation. As Bethge narrates the story of Bonhoeffer's involvement in the conspiracy, he peppers his account with signals of Bonhoeffer's specific involvement in attempts on Hitler's life. That is, we are ushered into the secretive world of intrigue, of espionage, of the life of a military intelligence agent who is attempting to undermine his own government. We are told, for instance, that Bonhoeffer ripped pages out of his diaries in 1938 and 1939 because they would be incriminating. In fact, the reader is informed that Bonhoeffer was involved, but had only a small role in planning coups in 1939 and 1940. Then we are brought to the third stage of the German resistance movement. That is the period between the Western Offensive in 1940 and the attempted assassination by Schlabrendorff in March of 1943, and Bonhoeffer's arrest on the 5th of April in 1943. It includes, says Bethge, Bonhoeffer's actual complicity in the plot against Hitler. Thus, we see Bonhoeffer's life linked with these attempts on Hitler's life in March of 1943, and we know that only a few weeks later, Bonhoeffer is arrested. Here is one of Bethge's brief summaries of these tense events as they unfolded. He says, Bonhoeffer's double life turned finally into a race between the conspiracy and the Gestapo as to who should reach its goal first. The conspiracy returning to destroy the Gestapo and the system which made it possible, the Gestapo to win control over Canaris's military intelligence service, not knowing by this they would actually desperately affect the conspiracy. Under suspicion of violating certain rules of the intelligence service, Bonhoeffer, his brother-in-law Hans von Donani, and some friends were arrested. But all suspicions were still unprovable. In prison, the main point at issue was by all possible diversions to shield the friends who were contributing to acts outside. This was successful until the complex plotting came to light after the failure of the attempt on Hitler's life on July 20th, 1944. End of quote. If we read carefully, we will notice a certain vagueness about Bethge's account. Few details are given, but his apparent claim here is consistent with what he implies in an interview clip in the 1983 documentary film Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Memories and Perspectives. Bonhoeffer was indeed personally involved in one or both of the two attempts to kill Hitler in March of 1943, and that his arrest on April 5th was linked to this involvement. Deepening our sense of Bonhoeffer's involvement, Bethge also reports various informal discussions in which Bonhoeffer supposedly affirmed the killing of Hitler. One such report is drawn from a conversation in the home of his brother-in-law, Hans von Donani, where Bonhoeffer is reported to have said, quote, that if it fell to him to carry out the deed of killing Hitler, he was prepared to do so. But Bethge goes on to say, it was a theoretical statement, of course, since Bonhoeffer knew nothing about guns or explosives. In the midst of discussing Bonhoeffer's involvement in the conspiracy, Bethge also notes the parallel shifts in Bonhoeffer's theological ethic by drawing contrasts between his mid-1930s book, Discipleship, and his later book, Ethics. This helps us to understand how the one who wrote Discipleship in 1937, apparently calling on followers of Jesus to renounce the use of violence, how he can, by the early 1940s, affirm the killing of enemies. But Bethge had prepared us for this earlier in his biography by informing us that Bonhoeffer never became a convinced pacifist. By the time we are brought to the point where Bonhoeffer is executed by the Nazi regime on April 9, 1945, we are not surprised that Bonhoeffer is killed on the same morning as other well-known conspirators, for he is one of them. They are all executed for their involvements in efforts to assassinate Hitler. Through Bethge's narration of Bonhoeffer's life as a conspirator, we readers feel like we have indeed been brought into the exciting world of intrigue, the world of spies and counter-spies. This is not simply the relatively uninteresting life of a theologian, but a life involved in potentially world-transforming events at one of the most important moments in modern history. So this is my summary of Bethge's account of Bonhoeffer's involvement in the conspiracy and how it created the myth that Bonhoeffer was personally involved in attempts on Hitler's life and was therefore executed because of his involvement. Of course, there are many ways in which the account in our book, Bonhoeffer the Assassin, is dependent on Bethge's, but there are also significant ways in which I've come to believe that Bethge is misleading. So the following is a way to read Bonhoeffer with and against Eberhard Bethge. So let's begin at the end of Bonhoeffer's life and trace our steps backward. Bonhoeffer was indeed executed on the same day as a number of conspirators. But anyone who watches a documentary drawn from the actual trials toward the end of the Nazi regime will know that the Nazis, especially in the last year or so of the regime, did not distinguish carefully among those who they considered to be enemies of the state. All such political prisoners were considered beyond contempt and were treated harshly. Anyone who studies the literature on the resistance movements will soon learn that thousands of prisoners were executed within the last year of the Third Reich, the vast majority of whom had nothing to do with attempts on Hitler's life. More specifically, there is no evidence that Bonhoeffer was executed because he was involved in attempts on Hitler's life. Absolutely none. Many are aware that Dietrich Bonhoeffer had been designated many are unaware that Dietrich Bonhoeffer had been designated a pacifist and enemy of the state publicly as early as March of 1936 by Theodor Heckel, the director of the Church Foreign Office of the German Protestant Church. We know this because of a memo that Heckel addressed to the Regional Church Committee in Berlin, in which he offered his opinion that Bonhoeffer should not be allowed to continue training pastors because he was unfit. Why was he unfit? Because he was a pacifist and enemy of the state. More than likely, Heckel offered such an evaluation of Bonhoeffer because he had attended many ecumenical gatherings in which Bonhoeffer had spoken. Thus, he heard Bonhoeffer support the confessing church over against the German Christians. He heard him challenge nationalism and anti-Semitism, encourage conscientious objection, and even say that Christians should not balk at using the word pacifist. Repercussions followed such critiques. In the fall of 1937, the Finkenwalde seminary that Bonhoeffer directed was forcibly closed by the Gestapo. Later, Bonhoeffer was forbidden from public speaking, publishing, or living in Berlin except to visit his family. All of this is to say, long before Bonhoeffer was executed as a political prisoner, he was considered an enemy of the state. He was also seen as a pacifist. Because of the collected works of Bonhoeffer, we now know exactly why Bonhoeffer was imprisoned. We have summaries of the court proceedings. The central issue for the court in Bonhoeffer's case is that he was effectively living out the life of a conscientious objector to Germany's war through his work with the Abwehr. That is to say, in September of 1943, Bonhoeffer was indicted on charges of avoiding the call-up to military service and thus was officially perceived to be, quote, subverting military power, end of quote. The court records show that the judge realized that Bonhoeffer's involvement in the Abwehr was a cover. It was a way for Bonhoeffer to exist in Nazi Germany without killing in Germany's war, without giving a personal oath of allegiance to Hitler, and yet still be able to do his work, mostly ongoing work for the church. More specifically, certain government employees in Germany were granted what was referred to as a UK status, which meant that their particular employment was considered indispensable for the welfare of Germany, and thus they were ineligible to be called up for military service in the field. Bonhoeffer was granted this UK status because of his work for the Abwehr. Both Eberhard Bethge and German theologian Sabine Drahm have emphasized the fact that Bonhoeffer's UK status was often under threat of being lost. Thus, his superiors within the Abwehr repeatedly made arguments to the authorities on his behalf that indeed his work for the Abwehr was essential for the welfare of Germany. When the judge examined the evidence in support of such a claim, he could see that this was a sham. The evidence in no way substantiated the claim that Bonhoeffer's work for the Abwehr was vitally important for Germany's welfare. Bonhoeffer's assignment with the Abwehr was simply a pretense so that Bonhoeffer could avoid his call up to serve in the military. Here is the way Sabine Drahm, in her book Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the Resistance, begins her summary of Bonhoeffer's involvement in the resistance movement within the Abwehr. She says, "At the beginning of Bonhoeffer's participation in the political resistance was the question about his call up for military service. Bonhoeffer was unwilling to perform military service for reasons of faith and conscience. But he of course knew that the penalty for such refusal straight out was death. Helped by Hans Oster, Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law Hans von Donani developed a particular construction that made the necessary UK status possible. In the foreground, therefore, of Bonhoeffer's decision to work for the Abwehr was not a unique, let alone datable, fundamental decision by Bonhoeffer to join the resistance. It was because of his personal, difficult, and risky decision to refuse to perform military service that he entered into the political work of the resistance with what was for him theological consistency." Drahm's astute assessment should surprise no one who knows much about Bonhoeffer's life. But wasn't Bonhoeffer involved in one or both of the two attempts on Hitler's life in March of 1943? Why else would he have been arrested just a few weeks later on April 5th? I do believe this is the impression left by Eberhard Bethge in his biography, in a few essays that Bethge wrote, and in interview clips and film documentaries. And I believe more than a few academics that I've talked with, many more than a few, believe this. But my hope is that many will come to see the importance of the claim made by Clifford Green, the executive director of the collected works of Bonhoeffer in English, when he says very clearly, quote, "No scholars or serious readers of Bonhoeffer believe he was personally involved in attempts to kill Hitler." That's what Clifford Green says. So what are the facts about these attempts in March of 1943? There were two assassination attempts on Hitler in March of 1943. The first one on March 13th involved the placing of a bomb on Hitler's plane. The fuse did not work on this bomb. The other one on March 21st was what we would now call an attempted suicide bombing. Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf, a senior intelligence officer of the Army Group Center, carried a small bomb in his pocket as he served as Hitler's escort while he was doing his annual viewing of weapons captured from the Soviets. Hitler stayed only a fraction of the time he was supposed to. Thus, Gersdorf disarmed the bomb. Obviously, neither attempt was successful, but what many do not know is that neither attempt was discovered by the authorities. Therefore, absolutely no one was arrested because of these two attempts on Hitler's life. Furthermore, these two attempts were planned and executed by a few people associated with Colonel Henning von Tresckow, the Chief of Staff of the Army Group Center. The only involvement on the part of anyone in the Abwehr was the securing of bombs which had nothing to do with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So why was Bonhoeffer arrested on April 5th, 1943? Bethge's account that I read earlier was technically accurate, that Bonhoeffer and his brother-in-law were arrested, quote, for violating certain rules of the intelligence service. However, in this account, he failed to mention a very significant detail. The rules violated had to do with financial irregularities. And these financial irregularities were related to what was initially referred to as Operation 7. Operation 7 was a successful effort on the part of Hans von Donani, with the help of others like Bonhoeffer, to rescue the lives of first 7 and eventually 14 Jews in helping them to escape from Germany. They posed as Abwehr agents. They were given fake IDs, and they were given a significant amount of money to travel to and resettle in Switzerland. After some investigation, the Gestapo discovered financial irregularities in the bookkeeping in the Munich office related to this operation. Of course, these German officials were furious that Jews were being helped in this way, but they also imagined, given the large sums of money, that the Abwehr agents who were involved were lining their own pockets with money as well. It didn't take long before links were established between this effort and Denani and Bonhoeffer. Thus, they were both arrested on April 5th. This operation is mentioned in summaries of the court proceedings in September of 1943. But once the judge discovered that Bonhoeffer's whole role in the Abwehr was a ruse to help him avoid military service, that became the judge's central focus. So what we can see is that Bonhoeffer was basically executed for reasons already given by Theodor Heckel in 1936. That is, Bonhoeffer was executed for being a pacifist and an enemy of the Nazi state. Once this is in view, then it begins to become obvious that his execution is the culmination of a trajectory that began in 1931. Let me briefly name this trajectory. Bonhoeffer underwent what I would argue was a substantial and permanent transformation, spiritually and theologically, between 1929 and 1932. Bethge refers to this as the theologian becoming a Christian, which seems an apt description. Bonhoeffer likely began this process through the discovery of the writings of his theological contemporary Karl Barth in the winter of 1924 and 1925. It was continued in the writing of his graduate theses in 1927 and 1930. But his transformation was truly accomplished and solidified through his experiences in New York City in 1930 and 31 while he was a student at Union Theological Seminary. This happened partly through his deep involvement in the large, dynamic, mostly African-American congregation, Abyssinian Baptist Church. It was also facilitated through his close friendship with the French Reform student, Jean Lasserre. Lasserre, the first pacifist Bonhoeffer had ever met of his own generation, apparently convinced Bonhoeffer through a serious reading of the Sermon on the Mount to become a pacifist. We know details about this transformation, what Bonhoeffer referred to as a grand liberation, because of a letter he wrote to his friend Elizabeth Zinn on January 27, 1936. He is giving her an account of a transformation that occurred in his life between 1929 and 1933. He confesses that he had too often in the past pursued his vocation as a theologian in an overly ambitious way, expressive of his own vanity. Because of that, he says he often found himself alone. He also confesses that though he is a theologian and a former pastor, neither the church nor prayer had previously been very important to him. He wrote, quote, "I was not yet a Christian, but rather in an utterly wild and uncontrolled fashion, my own master." And then he says he experienced a grand liberation. What made this transformation possible? Bonhoeffer reports that the Bible, especially the Sermon on the Mount, freed me from all of this. Being so liberated, he became clear, quote, that the life of the servant of Jesus Christ must belong to the church. And he entered the journey of becoming clearer about his own vocation. He also says that with this liberation, he came to see pacifism as utterly self-evident, which was a significant shift for him, for he had previously argued for the legitimacy of killing in the name of his country and family and had passionately argued against pacifism. I must pause here to comment on the best-selling biography of Bonhoeffer by Eric Metaxas. I rarely use the term deceptive to refer to other people's writings. But I don't know any other way to name Metaxas' treatment of this letter from Bonhoeffer to Elizabeth Zinn as it pertains to pacifism than to say it is deceptive. On pages 123 and 124 in his biography, Metaxas quotes almost the whole of this 1936 letter to Elizabeth Zinn. Almost the whole. he conveniently leaves out the paragraph where Bonhoeffer says he came to see pacifism as utterly self-evident. Having left out this important statement, he can then proceed to make several unsubstantiated claims. First, he claims that during his time in New York City, Bonhoeffer, quote, did not agree with Jean Lasserre's strongly pacifist views, end of quote. Later in his book, Metaxas claims that Bonhoeffer, quote, did not make an issue of conscientious objection to his students at the seminary from 1935 to 1937, which directly contradicts the testimony of Bonhoeffer's former students. Now back to the main argument regarding Bethge and Bonhoeffer. It is not as if Bethge doesn't say much of what I've said in relation to Bonhoeffer's transformation in New York City in 1930 and 31. In fact, long before we had the 16 volumes of Bonhoeffer's writings available, it was Bethge's quoting of this letter to Elizabeth Zinn that made me aware of this dramatic shift in Bonhoeffer's approach to the Christian faith. However, there are at least two ways in which I depart from Bethge, and after many years have become bold enough to argue that the evidence confirms my claims. The first and most important point is that I believe what happened to Bonhoeffer between 1929 and 1933 was indeed a transformation. It was a liberation that affected the whole of Bonhoeffer's life and thought, and there was no turning back. His basic reorientation to the Christian faith was permanent. The central way to name this permanency is to say that for the rest of his life, his faith and theology are centered in and redefined by the person of Jesus Christ. The implications of this are many, as indicated in his letter to Elizabeth Zinn. My second point is simply to highlight one of these implications, one that seems quite important to Bonhoeffer himself, namely that he came to see pacifism as utterly self-evident. One of the reasons we can specify when Bonhoeffer's transformation happened is because in February 1929, in a lecture to a German-speaking congregation in Barcelona, Spain, Bonhoeffer articulates his views on war. In that lecture, his views echo the dominant view among German theologians at the time, a view that he had probably held throughout his life. He says, "I will defend my brother, my mother, my people, and yet I know that I can do so only by spilling blood. But love for my people will sanctify murder, will sanctify war," end of quote. Bethge says that Bonhoeffer would never speak like this again, and indeed he does not. For after his year in New York City in 1930-31, his views changed dramatically. In the summer of 1931, after the school year in New York City, Bonhoeffer and Jean Lasserre together spoke publicly on peace in Mexico. Lasserre reports that Bonhoeffer advocated for pacifism every bit as passionately as he himself did. This is consistent with what Bonhoeffer began saying at ecumenical gatherings in Europe, beginning at least as early as 1932. For example, in December of 1932, in a lecture on Christ and peace to the German student Christian movement, Bonhoeffer said, quote, "The command, 'You shall not kill,' the word that says, 'Love your enemies,' is given to us simply to be obeyed. For Christians, any military service except in the ambulance corps and any preparation for war is forbidden," end of quote. In fact, through his active involvement in ecumenical gatherings from 1932 to 1937, Bonhoeffer repeatedly urged Christians to consider conscientious objection to war. On at least one occasion, he said we should not balk at using the word pacifist. But it is perhaps during the mid-1930s when his articulation of his views are most passionate and clear in relation to peace. For instance, in a sermon to his German-speaking congregation in London on 2 Corinthians, he makes the extraordinary claim that, quote, "Christianity stands or falls with its revolutionary protest against violence," end of quote. Lawrence Whitburn, one of his congregants in London, said that Bonhoeffer's opinion in favor of pacifism was so marked and clear in his mind that a discussion of the subject soon developed into an argument, though clearly not in such a way that it damaged their friendship. Around the beginning of 1935, there was apparently something about his understanding of faith in the Christian community that led Bonhoeffer's brother, Carl Friedrich, to perceive him as a fanatic. One of the inner circle of his first cohort of students at the Finkenwalde Seminary, Joachim Canitz, comments that, quote, "It became clear to us on the basis of an exegesis of the Sermon on the Mount given by Bonhoeffer that it is not possible for Christians to justify killing or to justify war," end quote. This interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount was part of Bonhoeffer's lectures on discipleship, lectures that were then published as a book with the same title. There he says, among other things, after about 10 pages of discussing loving your enemies, he says, "It is the great mistake of a false Protestant ethic to assume that loving Christ can be the same as loving one's native country, or friendship, or profession, that the better righteousness and civil justice are the same. Jesus does not talk that way. What is Christian depends on the extraordinary. That is why Christians cannot conform to the world, because their concern is the extraordinary. What does the extraordinary consist of? It is the existence of those blessed in the Beatitudes, the life of the disciples. It is the shining light, the city on the hill. It is the way of self-denial, perfect love, perfect purity, perfect truthfulness, perfect nonviolence. Here is undivided love for one's enemies, loving those who love no one and whom no one loves. It is the love of Jesus Christ himself, who goes to the cross in suffering and obedience. It is the cross. What is unique in Christianity is the cross, which allows Christians to step beyond the world in order to receive victory over the world. The passion in the love of the crucified one, that is the extraordinary mark of Christian existence." End quote. Bethge comments on how extraordinary it was to have a Protestant theologian. Bethge was a student at this time. Bethge comments on how extraordinary it was to have a Protestant theologian teaching them this and actively encouraging his seminary students to be conscientious objectors, especially after the military draft was reintroduced in the spring of 1935. So what about the claim that Bonhoeffer did an about-face in 1939? What seems clear is that Bonhoeffer's main reason for traveling to the U.S. in June of 1939 was to avoid his call-up to military service. He had said so in a letter to one of his good friends. However, he was never really at peace with this decision. I don't believe we will ever know exactly why he was finally able to achieve inner peace on his voyage back to Germany. He only stayed in New York City a few weeks in 1939. About all we have in writing is a letter he wrote to Reinhold Niebuhr, where he seems to suggest that he realized it was not right for him to abandon his own people. He needed to be willing to suffer with his fellow Christians through this horrible ordeal. He had spoken quite passionately about costly discipleship. He had also said publicly that peace was not the way of safety. It must be dared, he said. If his future ministry was to have any integrity, he must return to Germany, despite the pleas of his well-meaning American friends, to remain in the safety of New York City. One of his last conversations before he boarded the ship to return to his homeland was with Paul, his good friend from Union Seminary days, Paul Lehman. Lehman recalls this conversation. They had both recently read a book on the horrendous situation in Germany. Lehman tells Bonhoeffer that this book had caused him to abandon his pacifism, whereas Bonhoeffer said that it had only confirmed his commitment to pacifism. Once he was back in Germany, Bonhoeffer continued training pastors until that work was forcibly stopped. But he knew he still had to deal with the fact that he would be called up to serve in the military. Therefore, he applied to become a military chaplain. His application was denied. It appears that Sabina Drom, in her book on Bonhoeffer and the Resistance, and I have come to the same conclusion after examining the evidence. That is, Bonhoeffer then proceeded to have a conversation with his brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi, and Dohnanyi's boss, Hans Oster, who tell him that if he works for the Abwehr, they can make an argument to the authorities that his work for them is essential for the welfare of Germany, and then he will receive a UK status, which will mean he will not have to kill in the name of Adolf Hitler. This is why he went to work for the Abwehr. He then begins his, quote, work for the Abwehr, a military intelligence agency that employs more than 12,000 people, only a tiny fraction of whom are involved in resistance activities. This role allowed Bonhoeffer, the conscientious objector, to continue to work for the church, write essays, write letters to former students and families of former students, to write chapters of a future book on ethics, and had the unusual freedom during World War II to travel throughout Europe. He had the occasional meetings with other agents within the Abwehr, but he had many more meetings with his ecumenical friends outside of Germany. Those meetings helped sustain him during this trying time, as he wrote to a Swedish theologian friend in a letter on April 11, 1942. The more hopeless the ruptures in the world become, the more strongly Christians must maintain the bond of peace that unites them in Jesus Christ. Only in this way can the people someday find their way back to one another. End of quote. Once we get beyond the vagueness and ambiguities of Bethge's account of Bonhoeffer's role in the conspiracy, we can see the truth of what Sabina Dram says in the conclusion of her book, namely, that a closer analysis shows that Bonhoeffer's real part in conspiratorial resistance activities was much slighter than is usually assumed. To be more specific, Peter Hoffmann, perhaps the foremost expert in the world on the conspiracies against Hitler, names Bonhoeffer's role with his fellow conspirators within the Abwehr. He refers to Bonhoeffer's work within the Abwehr, quite appropriately, as putting out peace feelers. As he says very specifically, Bonhoeffer urged his ecumenical friends to use their influence in their own countries to ensure that the Allies would call a halt to military operations during the anticipated coup in Germany. End of quote. The only real evidence that Bonhoeffer shifted from the convictions he articulated in various lectures and in his book Discipleship is that of memories of informal conversations where Bonhoeffer supposedly affirmed the killing of Hitler. I have offered reflections on this in several previous writings. For now, let me draw a parallel. A colleague of mine at Eastern Mennonite University, a lifelong pacifist, used to live and work in Zimbabwe and other African countries. He tells me that he would not be at all surprised if some friends of his imagined that he would have affirmed the killing of President Robert Mugabe. For on certain occasions, in conversations with trusted friends and allies in the war against oppression and injustices within Zimbabwe, he would vent, express his empathy with those who wanted to stop Mugabe by any means necessary, who could not resonate with those who strongly opposed what were obvious forms of power abuse and oppression. But that didn't mean it was true that he affirmed the killing of other human beings, even Mugabe. But listeners with other frameworks of approaching issues such as a killing might easily have heard him in ways that weren't true to his own convictions. The same could easily have been true for Bonhoeffer, for probably no one around him had ever imagined encouraging conscientious objection to war, and no one resonated with his interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount. Besides, there are contradictory memories. I've already mentioned that Paul Lehmann reported that Bonhoeffer had reaffirmed his commitment to pacifism in the summer of 1939. Emmy Bonhoeffer, one of Dietrich's sisters-in-law, recounts a conversation she had with Dietrich sometime after he had returned to Germany in 1939. She says, reporting the conversation, "How is it that you Christians," she asked, "you will not kill, but that another one does, you agree and are glad about it? Why is that?" Dietrich responds, "One should not be glad, but I understand what you mean." Bonhoeffer met with Karl Barth on at least 6 occasions between 1940 and 1942. Barth was a trusted theological ally. Bethge says that Bonhoeffer told him, quote, "the whole truth." A decade later, Barth summarized his twin perceptions drawn from their conversations. On the one hand, he says, the Lutheran theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer belonged to the circles of those willing to kill Hitler. On the other, he says, he was really a pacifist on the basis of his understanding of the gospel. Franz Hildebrandt, whom Bethge referred to as Bonhoeffer's best and most like-minded friend, after he was told in 1945 that Bonhoeffer was involved in efforts to kill Hitler, said that he was sure he was not involved. But as I move toward my conclusion, I want to circle back around to what I claimed was Bonhoeffer's transformation during his time in New York City in 1930 and 31. I said that his grand liberation affected the whole of his life, the foundations of his faith and theology. Furthermore, I suggested that this transformation was permanent. There was no going back, and that this liberation of his life and thought was centered in the centrality of Jesus Christ. And finally, I suggested that, of course, this is not mostly about nonviolence or pacifism. In fact, I've come to believe that Bonhoeffer was wise in using abstractions like pacifism very rarely. What he did instead was to name the extraordinary grace of God made flesh in Jesus that perhaps only a Lutheran of profound faith can do. But he also showed that this grace is always a redeeming, transforming grace that makes the life of costly discipleship both possible and mandatory. Unfortunately, Eberhard Bethge has seriously distorted our appropriation of Bonhoeffer's work by claiming that in the last stage of his life he abandoned this understanding of costly grace, of serious discipleship. I believe this clouds our ability to see the wonderful consistency in Bonhoeffer's life and thought from 1931 to the end of his life. This would include his wonderful and rich use of the Psalms while in prison, and his writing of rich, provocative poetry from prison. But for now in this lecture, before I move to my brief conclusion, I want to offer some brief reflections on how it's simply not true that between 1940 and 1943, he no longer spoke of violence and nonviolence, the claim made by Bethge, and that he simply shifted to a sort of Weberian realism, an intellectual world in which concerns about expediency and success would be centrally defining. Moving passages in some of his manuscript on ethics show that this is simply not true. So a little bit on ethics and what he says that contradicts Bethge's claims. What are most challenging to the notion Bonhoeffer shifted his theological ethic and abandoned his commitment to the centrality of Jesus, a centrality that beginning in 1931 for Bonhoeffer entailed a commitment to the Sermon on the Mount and nonviolence, are Bonhoeffer's own written words and drafts of chapters for his book, Ethics, written between 1940 and 1943. Bonhoeffer in his work on ethics is doing some creative reframing. Take the terms realism and responsibility. These moral terms, which for some academics at the time carried considerable weight. These were moral terms which for some academics at the time carried considerable weight. Therefore, Bonhoeffer uses this language. But then he does some radical redefining by insisting that such terms be seen thoroughly in light of the centrality of Jesus Christ. In doing so, he subverts the very framework of meaning. It is no longer realism and responsibility that are the freight-bearing terms, but rather the God known in Jesus Christ, thus upending the whole moral framework. So this will be peppered with a lot of quotes from Bonhoeffer. I won't tell you every time I'm quoting from it. The source of a Christian ethic, Bonhoeffer says, is not the reality of one's own self, not the reality of the world, nor is it the reality of norms and values. It is the reality of God that is revealed in Jesus Christ. But pointedly, all concepts of reality that ignore Jesus Christ are abstractions. Toward the end of a substantial discussion of pseudo-realism, Bonhoeffer says, furthermore, the foundations of the so-called realism are false insofar as they fail to understand the meaning of the Christian concept of love, and thus the concepts of self-denial, forgiveness, suffering, renunciation, love of enemies, and innocence. Likewise, with responsibility, Bonhoeffer says, because of Jesus Christ, the essence of responsible action intrinsically involves the sinless becoming guilty. This is a very famous quote from Bonhoeffer. However, immediately following this provocative statement, he says, it is a sacrilege and an outrageous perversion to extrapolate from this statement a blanket license to commit evil acts. Only where a person becomes guilty out of love and responsibility does their action have a part in the justification pertaining to Jesus Christ's sinless guilt-bearing. The responsibility of Jesus Christ for all human beings has love as its content and freedom as its form. The commandments of God's righteousness are fulfilled in vicarious representative action, which means in concrete responsible action of love for all human beings. By grounding responsible action in Jesus Christ, we reaffirm precisely the limits of such action. The Sermon on the Mount, as the proclamation of the incarnate love of God, calls people to love one another and thus to reject everything that hinders fulfilling this task. In short, it calls them to self-denial in renouncing one's own happiness, one's own right, one's own righteousness, one's own dignity, in renouncing violence and success, in renouncing one's own life. A person is prepared to love the neighbor. Bonhoeffer concludes this chapter by offering 10 pages of argument for why the Sermon on the Mount is crucial for understanding our Christian actions within real human history. Toward the end of these reflections, written in 1942 Germany, he says, "The Sermon on the Mount is either valid as the word of God's world-redeeming, world-reconciling love everywhere and at all times, or it is not really relevant for us at all." Conclusion. I'm sure you're happy to the conclusion by now. A rather different Bonhoeffer. John DeGrucci, in his recent biography of Eberhard Bethge, says, had another of Bonhoeffer's close friends, say Franz Hildebrandt, become Bonhoeffer's literary executor and written his biography, in all likelihood we would have a rather different Bonhoeffer today. Indeed, what if Franz Hildebrandt had written Bonhoeffer's biography? In 1940, this Jewish Christian in 1940 wrote, "As a Christian and a minister of the church, I consider my means to fight Hitler different from those employed by the world. I cannot reconcile modern warfare with Christianity, though I respect my fellow Christians who are conscientiously able to do so. I would not object to an ordinary police force doing away with the Nazi Party, but I fail to see how the killing of thousands of lives on both sides will harm the guilty. I need not say how I feel about my colleagues of mine now fighting in Hitler's army. Pacifism, therefore, is to me a practical, not a doctrinal question. It is the question of what means the Christian citizen should have in the service of his country. My object is to preach the gospel and to assure my fellow Christians of the prayers and solidarity of our suffering church with them. It is for the cause of Christ I want to work." Renate Bethge, Eberhard's wife and Dietrich's niece, has said that when Bonhoeffer and his close friend Franz Hildebrandt met, they invariably talked theology. But when Bonhoeffer and Eberhard Bethge met, they invariably made music. It is possible that the reason Bonhoeffer and Hildebrandt invariably talked theology was because, as Eberhard Bethge himself said, Hildebrandt was indeed Bonhoeffer's closest and most like-minded friend, perhaps especially in relation to matters of theological ethics, and that Bethge was a different sort of friend, a profoundly trustworthy friend who, among other things, could be entrusted to be a faithful caretaker of Bonhoeffer's writings as he left them in his care. And is it possible that Hildebrandt's rather different Bonhoeffer, if it had been constructed, might at key points resemble the account offered in Bonhoeffer the Assassin, rather than the account offered to us by Eberhard Bethge? One critic of our book, Michael de Jong, has implied that I have tried to make Bonhoeffer into an Anabaptist. I am fairly sure that what he meant was that I imagined Bonhoeffer to have been like one of the most influential Anabaptist theologians today, namely John Howard Yoder or Stanley Hauerwas. In response to this claim, I would mostly say, no, actually, like this critic, I see Bonhoeffer very much as a product of his own times. More specifically, theologically, he was very much influenced by Luther and by his contemporary Karl Barth, to mention only two of the more significant influences. And then we have to say that clearly he departed from Luther in significant ways and went beyond Barth. In terms of Bonhoeffer's pacifism, I continue to resonate with the following wonderful summary offered by Clifford Green while substituting the phrase theological pacifism for his term Christian peace ethic. He says, Bonhoeffer's theological pacifism is intrinsic to his whole theology. It cannot be separated from his Christology, his understanding of discipleship and the Sermon on the Mount, his way of reading the Bible, and his understanding of the gospel and the church. It belongs to the heart of his faith. Accordingly, it cannot be reduced to a principle. It is not a discrete option on a menu of ethical positions. It is not a separate, interchangeable part that can be removed from his theology and replaced by something else called perhaps realism or even responsibility. His pacifism is woven throughout his theology and discipleship as a whole. It can't be removed without shredding the whole cloth. This way of putting it matters to me for three reasons. First, I believe it truly does fit with Bonhoeffer and his theology, including his beliefs and actions that he on occasion named as pacifism. Second, it is a reminder that for Christians, and for me this is extremely important, more important today probably than ever, for Christians, beliefs about matters like peace and social justice should always be integrated into our theology as a whole. In fact, within our present challenges, I believe Bonhoeffer's way of doing this can be quite illuminating. And third, Green's summary poses a challenge to those many interpreters of Bonhoeffer who would make him into an Niebuhrian realist. Bonhoeffer quite clearly was not that. Here is Bonhoeffer's friend Franz Hildebrandt's way of saying this as he introduced John Howard Yoder's 1959 essay, Peace Without Eschatology, with some slight paraphrasing by me. Here's what, and this is my closing paragraph from Franz Hildebrand. What is commonly said about Bonhoeffer the conspirator would be just as possible if Christ had never become incarnate, died, ascended to heaven, and sent his Spirit. In a theological and ecclesiastical climate where any literal application of the gospel is suspect of Schwärmertum, and where only the ex-pacifist is respectable, it will take some time and not a little humility to admit, especially for those trained in the school of the great reformers, that at this point in question, the Mennonite minority has been and still is right. Not because non-resistance works, but because it anticipates the triumph of the Lamb that was slain. Thank you.
So I think we have time for two questions. Yeah, two questions, and then he'll be around. Dr. Thiessen Nation will be around tomorrow as well and can take, of course, more questions. So, yes.
Hi, my name is Daniel from the Heritage Foundation. Thank you for the talk. My question, as one who's been familiar with the popular narrative that you describe as a non-expert, as I am on Bonhoeffer, my question is, the popular narrative that's often received is that I've been aware of, is that Bonhoeffer not so much ever formally rejected pacifism or positively embraced realism, but that his actions didn't completely correspond with his formal assent to pacifism. Given the facts that you've laid out about his life in his final years, do you think it's reasonable for someone to infer from his lived life any daylight between his formal views as he stated them and his actions until the end of his life?
No, I mean, I'm working on a book right now on Bonhoeffer, and one of the reasons I continue to be fascinated by him, see him as a martyr, and see him as, in many ways, instructive for our present time, is because I do see, I mean, we all fail. Bonhoeffer was well aware that he failed, but given that reality is for us human beings, even us Christians, I think his life is remarkably consistent with what he believed, and what he believed to the end. It's interesting, when I sent two early drafts of 2 chapters from this book to a Catholic that I knew was a strong pacifist, he hated what I was doing, and he thought Bonhoeffer was corrupted for having anything to do with the Abwehr or the resistance movement. Well, I don't agree with that. I do think the times changed. There's no question about what the times changed once World War II was underway, and he knew a lot about what was going on in Nazi Germany, a lot more than the average German, because of his connections in high places, including his brother-in-law Hans von Dohnanyi, who had a high position in office since Hitler came to power. So Bonhoeffer knew a lot, and he was related to a lot of powerful people. So he knew what was going on. Things had changed in 1939, 1940. So of course, whatever your convictions are, there's some particulars that will have to change. And as I read what he did in his life in those last years, I find them remarkable. The chapter I'm working on in my book right now is actually about his time in prison. And there's been some wonderful writings recently about the way in which Bonhoeffer lived daily with the Psalms and his reflections on the Psalms. He said toward the end of his life that his major theological project in the last stage of his life was writing this set of reflections on Psalm 119. And he had finished about 21 pages of those reflections before he died. But his reflections on the Psalms, as I said in my lecture, some of his rich poetry from prison, some of his theological reflections, I think all of that is also reflective of his desire to be faithful to God to the very end, in very trying times and difficult circumstances.
You want to? I'll listen for it.
Yeah, just as a, without getting into the debate about Bonhoeffer's participation or non-participation in assassination attempts, it seems to me that in a regime that he found himself in, you could be very much a pacifist of a sort. You could be a conscientious objector, say, okay, I'm not going to fight for this guy. All right, I'm not going to fight for the Nazi regime. And without being inconsistent, say, I'm going to take this guy out. Because, as we know, the non-pacifist Christian tradition has always allowed for tyrannicide, very cautiously. So, there's no inconsistency, but it depends on attaining a very precise definition of what you mean by pacifist. If you have a loose definition, you can say, yeah, you shouldn't, even a just war guy would say, I shouldn't participate in an unjust war, and then start to talk about using the term pacifism loosely. Particularly, as you said, that, well, you know, it's not like he's become a Mennonite. You see what I'm saying? I don't want to get into the debate of whether he has or not, but just reflect on the notion that there's no inconsistency with tyrannicide on the one hand and not fighting for the regime as a conscious objector on the other. Selective conscience.
Right. I mean, I would grant that it is theoretically, philosophically, theologically, maybe theoretically, philosophically possible anyway, and one could make a theological argument probably, for some narrow understanding of pacifism that would allow for what you're naming. I think that's possible. I mean, I'm pretty aware of a variety of types of pacifism. John Howard Yoder named 29 different types in his book, Nevertheless. So I think that's possible. I've known a lot of pacifists now over the last 45 years. I didn't grow up in the Mennonite church. I never heard of pacifists or Mennonites till I became an adult. But I've known a lot of pacifists now. I've never met a pacifist for whom that would be true. It's about loving everyone and not killing human beings created in the image of God. Which doesn't mean you might not, I mean, it's one of the things many people are unaware of it in the United States, is that a lot of the generals who wanted to bring down Hitler did not want to use violence. They did not want to kill him. So there were a variety of efforts to get rid of Hitler before 1943 that didn't entail any lethal violence at all. They were simply going to capture him and have him stand trial. And they thought the evidence was so obvious that he would clearly be brought down. So not all of the efforts to bring Hitler down and to bring him out of power entail the use of lethal force. That's one thing. The other thing, one of the things, I haven't decided whether I'm going to write a chapter on this, but I think nobody who has responded to our book has mentioned anything about the fact that he was a conscientious objector. Well, and the other interesting and troubling, very troubling fact, that virtually nobody, I don't know of anybody, I've never read about anybody after 1935, certainly after 1933 when the pacifist organizations were put out of existence by Hitler. I don't know of any Christians who were Lutheran or Reformed or part of the United Protestant Church or Catholics who refused to fight in Hitler's war because of the just war theory. Does the just war theory mean anything at all if you can't see that this is an unjustifiable war? So that Bonhoeffer was encouraging Christians to be conscientious objectors by itself, apart from attempting to kill Hitler, is extremely important. And why is it that only a man who calls himself pacifist talks about conscientious objection? No one else was doing that. Bethge mentions in a lecture, an essay I've recently translated from the German, that he had never heard of any Protestant theologian saying anything like that. But Bonhoeffer did. So that's something very important that is almost totally ignored, and certainly ignored in relation to Bonhoeffer. So it's not just about whether or not he was willing to or involved in attempts to kill Hitler. It was also that he was a conscientious objector to the war.
Okay, I think we're going to do one more.
Okay.
Because Mark is begging.
I promise it'll set up tomorrow's panel so well. Thank you. I'm Mark Bethge. I'm with Providence Magazine. We'll be speaking on a panel tomorrow, so you can beat me up then, which I feel comfortable saying to a pacifist. I feel less comfortable saying this, but your project reminds me of an episode of South Park. Let me explain. There's a scene where I'm going to get my names wrong, where Cartman says to Kyle, in a moment of existential threat, Cartman says to Kyle, all those times I called you a big dumb Jew, I'm sorry, you're not a Jew. And Kyle says, Cartman, I am a Jew. And Kyle says, don't be so hard on yourself. Now, bear with me. The correlation I see is that Cartman is trying to disabuse Kyle of the least offensive character about him, the least offensive part of him. So Bonhoeffer's, so then let me set this up a little bit more. I know what to do with Bethge's Bonhoeffer. Bethge's Bonhoeffer is tragic. I think you're right that Bethge tries to make him into a Niebuhrian. And I think Niebuhr is tragic. He believes that the Christian life requires one, because of the circumstances of this world, to do what ought not to be done. So you abandon or overrule or diminish or whatever you do love for the sake of responsibility, or I think you said expediency, etc. So that's tragic. Your project seems to preserve Bonhoeffer from Niebuhrian tragedy, but I would suggest you render him instead in dereliction of Christian duty. In the midst of Hitlerism, it doesn't seem to me that there was a choice between being violent or non-violent. Violence had erupted all over the place. And the only choice that was left was, what are you going to do about it? And you suggest that in light of the requirements of enemy love, one must not kill one made in the imago Dei. My question then is, okay, in light of neighbor love, what does one do when one imago Dei is unjustly having their face kicked in by another imago Dei? And why do we find Bonhoeffer's possible participation in the elimination of Hitler so offensive? What else was he supposed to do?
Well, yeah, very good question, we could have a long conversation around all of that.
Right.
So let me just say 3 or 4 things quickly. One of the things I want to do in my paper and in the first book, in different ways in the second book, is to clarify what the facts are and are not. It's one thing to argue what you're arguing in terms of what one should do. I think it's first important to know what the facts are.
Sure.
And I think Bethge has distorted the facts. So that's one of my projects and one of the things I wanted to do. And then we can disagree and talk about the other things. Our second point to make is that in the opening chapter of the book, I use Helmut von Moltke as a fascinating example. Helmut von Moltke was a well-known, his father or grandfather was a well-known general in the military. And so he was automatically fairly well-known in his young adult life. He was an attorney specializing in international law. He also worked for the Abwehr. And he wrote letters to his wife, some of which are amazing and very interesting, reflecting on his faith and how his faith affected what he did and so on. And among other things, he says, for both principled reasons and practical reasons, that he did not think it made any sense to kill Hitler. So he thought, for practical reasons, as an international lawyer, he was not a pacifist, but he did not believe it made any sense to try to kill Hitler. He did not think it was practical, and he didn't think it was the right thing to do. And there would be various arguments in Christian history, apart from pacifism, that would make those arguments. I also, interestingly, when I was, at a table in a coffee shop, working on the chapters of the first book, a Jewish scholar came by who teaches at James Madison University, and he's both an expert in the Holocaust and an expert in the civil rights movement. And when we talked about what I was doing, he said, as an expert in the civil rights movement and the Holocaust, as a Jew, that he thought it was a stupid idea to try to kill Hitler. It was not practical, it was not a good thing to do, and the repercussions would be terrible. That's what he thought, just from his analysis of having read a variety of things. Finally, it's also interesting, again, I understand your points and I understand how one could make that argument. Oh, I guess two more things. One thing is, briefly, that we need to remember, I mean, for all of us, it is impossible when you see images of the swastika, images of Hitler, not to know evil, 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 evil. People in Germany didn't know evil, 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 evil. People even in 1938, 1939, a lot of people didn't know what was going on with Hitler. So tyrannicide, one has to make a very careful... Tyrannicide, if it's ever justifiable, even by certain understandings of the just war theory, obviously one needs to have to make very careful arguments. Tyrannicide is a horrible thing. It should happen very, very rarely. So was it that obvious that Hitler had to be brought down in 1940? Maybe 1943 one could make that argument. But there are a lot of earlier attempts, of course. The final thing, which I think in retrospect is quite important, is that I see some of you know Clifford Green in one of his essays quotes all of this stuff. I don't remember all of it off the top of my head. But what Bonhoeffer is believed to have done, getting involved in attempts to kill Hitler, has been used to justify murdering doctors who perform abortions. It's been used to justify killing dictators in Latin America. It's been used to justify killing lots of different leaders around the country, and so forth and so on. Bonhoeffer has been used as an example, a model for killing lots of people in lots of different situations. Is that surprising? Are we amazed by that? As I said, a lot of the generals wanted to go a different route than murdering Hitler. His brother-in-law, if you don't know this, Hans von Donati, it was discovered after he was arrested that one of the reasons why he was tortured and he really experienced hard things in prison was because Donati, for many years, beginning in 1933, had been keeping a catalog of all of the sins of the Hitler regime. He was keeping a list of all of the horrible things they were doing. And he hid them, I think, in his backyard at first, and then they moved them somewhere else. But it was discovered by the Nazis, and so they were furious. But he was doing this precisely because if they wanted to bring Hitler to trial, they needed to have a lot of facts. They needed to know what they were talking about. And then if you do it that way, you don't have somebody justifying killing a doctor who performs abortion through murder in a civilized society by invoking the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer or even Hans von Donati.
Actually, we've got to cut it off there tonight.
Thank you all.
Thank you.